We're very excited to have a wonderful guest today. And there's so much that I can say about our guest today, and I know you will share my excitement. But I'm going to partner with my good friend, Ryan. So I'm going to pass the baton over to my buddy, Ryan, and he will take it from there. Ryan?
Hey, good morning, everybody. I am so excited to have Tracy Brower with us today. Every once in a while, you meet somebody that is just extra special and helps you to get excited about what you do again. And Tracy's one of those people for me. She's an amazingly accomplished person, a writer. You may have read her book, Bring Work to Life by Bringing Life to Work. It's a great book if you haven't read it. In addition to all the writing that she does, she's the principal for applied research and consulting for Steelcase, which is a really awesome role. She gets to sort of look into the future and figure out how to apply the amazing insights that Steelcase produces to the environments that you guys are designing. And in addition to being a prolific writer, she's a mom, she's a photographer, and an all-around amazing person. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tracy Brower.
Awesome. Thank you for that nice introduction. It's always so dangerous to have a lovely, wonderful introduction like that. Now everybody has to reduce their expectations. So thank you for that. You made my morning. Thanks for having me. This is really cool. I'm excited to be with you and focus on this topic with a creative recharge. Last week, I think that you had some really great time on mindfulness and meditation and peace and presence. And today we're going to charge up and move really quickly through lots of materials. So really, really looking forward to that. We can go to the next slide. So grab a pen and paper. We're going to ask you to do some note taking during the session and some easy exercises, but pen and paper doesn't actually sound very creative. So if we could go to the next slide, let's go ahead, and if you're moved to have a crayon in your hand instead, that's all good and way cool. Let's go to the next slide. We want to start with the concept of flow. You've all heard about flow. This is what athletes talk about when they get into the flow state and they really have a sense for performing at their highest levels and kind of almost like removing themselves from the present world and being able to perform in ways that they had never been able to perform before, or are able to access a whole nother level of capability. And so flow is possible for all of us. It's actually an enhanced mental state that's based on a huge cocktail of chemicals in our brain that give us extra energy, extra focus, extra happiness, and extra positivity and optimism. And so it's happening at a neurochemical level. The other very cool thing about flow is, you know how there's all the science about we only use 10% of our brain or we only use 13% of our brain? Flow is actually when we use a partial part of our brain in a really good way. A lot of times what happens in flow is we turn off a level of vigilance about ourselves, and it's all about focusing on the goal. And so that vigilance about how we look or what we're thinking or what's going on around us actually can get in the way, and it gives us a level of efficiency when we're able to focus on the goal. We are in really, really uncertain times, and actually that uncertainty and challenge and risk and ambiguity are characteristics of getting into the flow state. So even though it seems counterintuitive, it can actually be a perfect time to get into flow. So let's go to the next slide. Question for you. Have you ever been in flow? The answers optionally are A, yes, regularly, B, probably yes, I have, or C, perhaps not so much. If I'm not sure, does it mean I haven't? Can you let us know, David, what we're seeing mostly? Mostly C's. All right. Yeah, I know. And especially today, it can be hard to imagine being in flow. You know, flow is one of those times where you kind of just are so into the moment of your work that you lose time and you say to yourself, wow, I'm not even sure where it went. So let's talk a little bit more about that. We can go to the next slide. Here is how to get into flow. The basics are really important. First of all, you need good sleep, you need to be rested, you need to eat healthfully, and have a positive state of mind. If you're super stressed out, it's hard to get into flow, but gratitude can be a bridge to flow. So thinking about things that you're grateful for tends to make you feel more positively, and that attitude and that basic state of mind can be really, really helpful. The other way to get into flow is to really think about a goal, to get really clear about that goal in mind and really clear about what you want to accomplish. The other super important part of flow is actually about feedback. So when you think about flow, it can a lot of times be people who are mountain climbing, or people who are running a sprint or a marathon, people who are doing physical activity. And the cool thing about physical activity is that you get lots of feedback. You know what your time was, you know how you're performing, you know if you slipped on that rock as you're rock climbing. And so if you can get feedback about your work, that can also be really helpful to flow. The other thing that can help flow is feeling like you've got great connections with other people. One of the things we know sociologically is that we tend to have really strong bonds with people that we've been through hard times with. That is the common enemy phenomenon. And so this is a great opportunity to feel that bond, because we're all going through so much right now. And so feeling that connection with others can help you get into flow. And we go to the next slide. So here's a question for you. In a few words, if you've been in flow, how did you know you were there? So lots of you said C, that you're not sure you've been there or not. But when you've really felt good about your work, when you've really felt like you're hitting on all cylinders, what has that felt like in a few words? Usually what we see is people say, oh, I felt focused, I felt energized, I felt connected to other people. I felt like I was in another zone. I felt like I was achieving. I lost a sense of time. That's really interesting, is when people lose that sense of time. It everything kind of slows down in some people's experience, and other people say, oh my gosh, it sped up and I lost track of time. Things happen so quickly. So those are some of the ways that you might know that you're in flow. And of course, you know you're in flow because you've achieved great results. The other thing we wanted to talk just a couple of minutes about is resilience. We never have needed resilience so much as what we need it now. And there are 3 elements of resilience. These are the ingredients for resilience. Resilience is about, first of all, knowing reality, right? Like, how can you not know reality now unless you're hiding under a rock, I suppose. Sometimes we have more reality than we want. And it's really good to set a boundary. You know, maybe you only want to watch the news for a half hour in the morning and a half hour in the evening or something. But knowing reality and having a sense of what's around you is important to really great resilience. The other thing is to make sense of it. You get a sense of the long term, you get a sense of perspective, and you can kind of make sense of where did this come from and where might we be going from here. And that's just about thinking through things and kind of getting yourself down to earth on things. And then the last part of resilience is a sense of improvisation, knowing that you can respond, kind of figuring out how you're going to go forward. For those of us who are old enough, I always like to compare this to the MacGyver effect. MacGyver was this, like, I don't know, high adventure guy who, I think he would solve crimes. I think that was his shtick, but he would always get himself into scrapes or situations where he was kind of trapped, and he could figure it out. If he had a stick of chewing gum and a paper clip and some duct tape, he could, you know, make a rocket. And so this is the MacGyver effect. This is figuring it out, rolling up your sleeves and finding new ways to do things. A lot of times the most creative solutions come from the most significant barriers. And so resilience is about finding that improvisation even amidst all the barriers. And we can go to the next slide. So here's a question for you. What is your current level of stress? Are you cool as a cucumber on the left and kind of, you know, unflappable? Or on the right, are you barely hanging on and you're kind of, you know, on the phone to your nearest clinic to help you pick up the pieces? Any of those are super fair game. And I'm taking that lightly, but really there are very significant mental health challenges going on right now. And that is not a light topic. If you look at the research, 75% of people are reporting time that they feel stressed or fatigued or anxious or have mental health challenges. And so that is about us really being able to support each other. So if you want to put in the chat what your level is, that would be awesome. It looks like maybe the Q&A isn't working, so you can enter your answers into the chat and kind of let us know where you are. It looks, Ryan, like you were able to see the chat earlier, and so you might be able to let me know where people are on the stress continuum. This is where your pen and paper come in, so if you want to make yourself a continuum and write your answers, that would be great. In general, I think we see, oh, go ahead.
Tracy, this is Ryan. We're having some trouble with the Q&A feature today. Okay. So we're not able to see that live right now. But I'll add in that for me, my current level of stress is pretty low because I'm on this call. But what I will say is that I think I've noticed an experience that since this shutdown, my variability and stress level is pretty extreme. It's moment to moment.
Yeah. Oh boy, do we hear so much about that, Ryan. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, moment to moment. I think we're hearing from people who kind of they're okay for a while and then it hits them again, and then they kind of get on even ground and it hits them again. One of the things that's really unique about this type of challenge and the situation we're going through is that things have changed so fast, and that creates a sense of cognitive dissonance. I mean, like if you look back, it was the first week of March, things were kind of still normal. Our daughter was home from college on break, and she and I were shopping, although the mall was kind of quiet, nothing was closed yet, and then things changed so quickly, and then they change again and change again. And just when you think you know what to expect, guidelines change or the virus mutates. And so it makes perfect sense that if things weren't changing all the time, our stress levels would be up and down and all around, because this is so unnatural. But with things changing, that causes shifts as well. The other thing that is true about our context that makes a difference is that we are all going through this together at the same time. Like a lot of changes that we talk about historically have affected certain groups first, or they've taken longer to develop. And this has happened so fast, and it's affecting all walks of life, all socioeconomic levels, all types of work. And that is what makes it such a sea change. So that's great. Thanks for sharing that, Ryan. All right, let's go to the next slide. The other thing that's kind of interesting to think about is our reactions to dissonance can be really different. Sometimes people lock up. Like if you're in a high level of stress, you might lock up, you might feel paralyzed, you might feel like, oh my gosh, I can't possibly have a creative thought in my mind, and it's really hard to create. Other people end up at the other end of that continuum and really end up with OCD, obsessive creative disorder, and they find themselves creating and wanting to do more and having more creative ideas actually than less creative ideas. And so it's interesting to think about on this one where you would want to be. So if we go to the next slide, and you can go ahead and thank you. So what's your creative status? This one I've got as kind of a up and down instead of a straight line continuum, because this too can be definitely a variable situation, but curious where you are. Are you paralyzed? Are you wildly creating? Are you somewhere in the middle? What are the conditions that drive that? So just give yourself a minute and kind of on your paper and pencil, or your paper and crayon, or your paper and pen, go ahead and make a note for yourself about where you are on this continuum. The reason it's important to think about is that knowing where you are can help you create the conditions to be more toward the creative. You don't want to be manic. We're not looking for wild manic creation, but the more you can create and improvise, the more it tends to be a great way of coping and a great way of handling the stress. So anyone on the call who's able to unmute, thoughts about this, Ryan or others? Otherwise, we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, yeah, Tracy, it's Jason. I'll chime in. I find myself to be more creative in the morning, and I wonder, I'm not a morning person by any means, but I find myself, especially being in all these Zoom meetings and Teams meetings, end of the day, I'm just kind of burned out, and I just, even like when it comes to writing like an important email, I'm like, I'm going to save that for tomorrow. So I just find with all the time on video and all the calls that, you know, I get, I guess, more paralyzed end of the day and more creative in the morning when I'm fresh.
Oh, that's brilliantly said. Yes, so interesting, right? Daniel Pink wrote a book called When. If you haven't read it, I'd highly recommend. It's a quick read, tons of super interesting evidence and research that's just very, very accessible and interesting. But interesting, different people have different circadian rhythms, and so they tend to be more creative at different times of the day. But no matter what your circadian rhythm, earlier in your day usually tends to be the time when you can be more focused and get some of those heavier things done. Just to your point, Jason, absolutely, super interesting. And the other thing we know is that working from home and being in Zoom meetings is actually more intense than the normal workday. And the reason is that you are typically focusing in one place all day versus letting your eyes wander across a campus. You tend to not remember things as well because your context isn't changing. Like, you know how when you're in a conference room, you go like, oh, remember we were in classroom 6 and we talked about XYZ, or remember we were on the whiteboard and we had that pink post-it on the upper right. We tend to cement our memory based on place and based on our surroundings. And when we're in one place intensively all day, we tend to not remember as well. And that can be disconcerting, and it can create levels of dissonance. And it can also be super intense because you're kind of face to face up close with people all day long. And it might also be causing you to be more vigilant about yourself. Like, we're just not used to seeing ourselves on video camera all day, every day. And so that intensity can make us tired sooner. The other thing you might think about is sometimes you can tap into more creative energy toward the super latter part of your day. So afternoons tend to be slump periods, but then sometimes we get a creative surge. And the reason is that in the morning, you tend to be more vigilant, you're kind of fresh, whatever morning is for you, even if it's late morning. And then by the latter part of the day, that's when you're starting to wind down. And sometimes that lower vigilance can actually lead to less filtering, like careful filtering of your ideas, and more opportunity for divergent thought. So give some thought to that too, and tap into that creative spirit when it works best for you. We can go to the next slide. So how do you get to your creative best? And what I'd like you to do is give some thought to these. Which are most familiar to you? Like, yeah, I've heard that before. And which are the ones that work best for you? And I'll ask our small panel to comment on this as well. So here are the ways to be your creative best. First of all, connect. We are all social creatures, whether we're introverts or extroverts. We all need some level of togetherness and time alone. We just tend to need those in different proportions. But that connection, that human connection, is so critical. The other thing that's been really stressful about the situation we're in is we know that our instinct as biological creatures, as humans, is to connect. When we see threat or when we see danger in any way, our instinct is to band together. There's safety in numbers, and that is based on millennia of our time and our instinctual growth. And this flies in the face of that, this social distancing, this need to kind of stay apart from others. So connect in any way that you can in order to keep that creative spirit. A lot of times other people can help you think creatively. The other thing to do is give. There's a wonderful study on generosity that talks about how incredibly good generosity, altruism, and giving are for your own mental health. They're good for other people, but they're also really good for you because it tends to reinforce what you have if you're able to give it away. And it also tends to remove the focus on yourself. And when you remove focus on yourself, it's similar to the flow state. You tend to be able to kind of free up your thinking and be more creative. So that idea of giving and altruism is a really, really great way to tap into more creativity. The other thing that's super interesting, there's some brand new research on the familiar and how the familiar can help you reduce stress and be more creative. The familiar is like that old TV show that you really like, or that show that you love to binge watch and maybe you're re-binge watching it, or music that is familiar to you. In general, the music that is most familiar to us and the music we tend to like best is the music we enjoyed when we were in high school. Whatever generation you were, what you listened to in high school tends to be what is most familiar and what you like most, and the things you can remember the words to, even if it may have been 30 years ago. So seek the familiar. That familiarity tends to make us more comfortable, and we can access more of that creativity. The other thing to do is manage attitude. You have heard, I'll believe it when I see it. Lots of evidence points to the opposite, that we see what we believe, like what you expect is what you tend to see. And there's some brand new research as well that what you believe and how you feel about something will absolutely color how you interpret what you hear. So if you have a really negative view of what's going on, of the pandemic, and you get any kind of information, you will likely feel more negatively about the information coming at you. And so the more you can kind of elevate your attitude, the less you'll be dragged down by the information coming at you. So there's kind of this cause and effect relationship where the better your attitude, the more optimistic you are, the better you'll feel about what's coming in. So manage your attitude, and you can do that significantly through all those connections and giving and familiarity. Moving is really, really important. Moving tends to really cement learning and reflection. Literally, the more you move, the more you cement brain connections. And moving is just good for you physically as well as cognitively. It's also really good emotionally. You tend to get a nice neuroscience kind of cocktail, a neuro cocktail that helps you feel really good about what you're doing. Get outside. Nature has been absolutely correlated with better mental health. There's a brand new study where they looked at moms and daughters who went to parks or went to a mall, and the moms and daughters who went to the parks had a better relationship and better attitudinal outcomes. Super interesting. They've done tons of studies about, like, if you take a break and you have a plant in the break room or a plant wherever you're breaking in your home, you'll have a better experience. Even rooftop gardens were more impactful than taking a break in a micro kitchen for people when they were in their work day. So those that nature and that opportunity to get outside is critical. Blue light is something to avoid. Blue light tends to turn us on in all ways. Blue light comes from every device and it's emitted constantly. And so blue light is at the beginning of the spectrum. And so blue light is associated with sunrise. And so instinctually, blue light wakes us up. It turns on 7 different parts of your brain. And so if you have a lot of exposure to blue light, you don't get that downtime that you need. And particularly at bedtime, if you don't get that great sleep, you can't get into flow as much and you can't get as much creativity. So avoid blue light as much as possible. I know it's impossible to avoid it altogether, but the more you can avoid it, like reading a book rather than your Kindle, something like that might be helpful. And take breaks. We know that breaks are really, really important. So all of these are ways to be at your creative best. So anyone on the panel want to comment on which of these is most familiar to you? Like, yeah, I've heard that before, but more importantly, which of these might be most impactful for you?
So Tracy, it's Ryan. I think getting out and moving around, those things are kind of correlated. Like, I found that when working at home, it's helpful to just get up and take a walk around the yard or walk around the block and stretch your legs and get some fresh air.
Brilliant. Yes, absolutely. You might, if you live in a city, maybe you're getting fresh air on the fire escape. Maybe if you can't get out, you're walking around the couch, but any of that is super helpful. And we can go to the next slide. And we can go to the next slide. So we were hoping to kind of think about one takeaway from the discussion, but I think, Jason, you might lead us in a couple of questions that you might have in mind. And so I think we can go to the next slide and we'll just close on that with any additional discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Tracy. I had a couple questions, and then also just want to let everyone know that's on the call that you can see all Tracy's information. So if you have any questions, since the Q&A wasn't quite working right, just like anyone at Steelcase, please feel free to reach out. Tracy's very responsive and should be happy to talk to you about it. Yeah, one of the first questions I had, Tracy, was when we were talking about flow in the beginning, is there a way someone can practice or kind of test to see this is my best time? Quick little ways or indicators to say this doesn't work for me, this time's better.
Yeah, completely. That's a really, really great point. And I think it's really interesting to think about like what's the work you need to do and what's the time that's best to do it. So you've got like your focused work or your work that requires more concentration. You've got work that you maybe want to be more creative or you need to think more divergently. You've got work alone and you've got work with others. So it's really helpful to think about that in relation to the times of day. And I think it's just so about staying in tune with yourself and being really intentional about those conclusions that you draw. So the 5 modes of work that are super helpful to think about are focus, collaborate, learn, socialize, and rejuvenate. My suggestion is you try to rejuvenate throughout the day. One of our lessons learned from a lot of the agile work, as a matter of fact, is the more intense your work, the more you need to rejuvenate. And we know that this experience is more intense than it's ever been. And so we need that rejuvenation. But yeah, what you might even do is kind of keep a log of those other elements of work and think about what works best for you. Frequently, people say that focus and learning is really great early in your day, and that you might later on in the day really get more from socializing and collaborating.
And I'll ask one last one in the essence of time. When I looked at that list you just had up, connecting really jumped out to me, because when I think of us or our clients and you're working in a team and you're grinding through a project, you're trying to get CDs out or whatever that may be. Typically, if you're in a group, someone can carry the energy at different times because it's impossible to always be the person carrying the energy. So I wonder how, for you, or what your thoughts are around that is now we're not in these groups, so you're having to carry that energy all day by yourself. So some ways to combat that or get better at it, I'd be interested to get your thoughts.
Oh my gosh, that is brilliantly said. That's another element of that intensity, right? That makes us so tired at the end of the day. I would say make sure you take breaks with the people around you. I know some people live alone, and so that break with people around you, quote unquote, may need to be virtual. But use that small group that you've got, and then reach out to those coworkers. I know lots of us have been just, calling up friends and colleagues to kind of stay connected. And I think sometimes it's just great to turn off the video camera. Like I heard from a colleague one time recently, she said, what makes us think we have to have our cameras on all the time? Like usually it's really important because we need that and we're not getting it any other way. But sometimes it's cool to just call up your friend and be on the phone with that person and not have to be on camera. And so you're so right, those connections and that ability to kind of get rejuvenated through that connection with others can be so critical. So that's a great question. I love that thinking.
Well, awesome. We appreciate your time, Tracy. We've hit our 30-minute window, but obviously always great information, and we appreciate it. Anyone that has any further questions, feel free to reach out to Tracy directly or any of us on the panel. We'll be happy to get you the answer, connect you with Tracy. So everyone have a great Thursday. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. See ya.